Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one the whole wilderness remembers. Ethan Brooks had repeated those words to his daughter more times than he could count, but neither of them imagined they would become the beginning of the most unbelievable chapter of their lives. The first snowfall had not yet arrived in northern Montana, yet the morning air carried the crisp scent of pine and cold stone that always reminded Ethan another season was quietly approaching. He guided his aging pickup truck along a narrow Forest Service road while 10-year-old Lily Brooks sat beside him, studying a folded wildlife map with the same curiosity she brought to everything she loved. Their small cabin rested only a few miles away, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines, clear streams, and endless ridges that had shaped generations of hardworking families. Ethan had raised Lily there ever since losing his wife years before, believing the forest could teach lessons no classroom ever could. "Do you think we'll see elk today?" Lily asked with an eager smile. Ethan glanced toward the trees and smiled back. "Maybe," he answered softly. "But the forest decides what it wants us to see." They continued deeper into the national forest, stopping every so often to collect fallen branches for winter firewood and to photograph animal tracks for Lily's growing scrapbook. She dreamed of becoming a wildlife biologist someday, and Ethan never laughed at her dream, even when money was tight enough that every gallon of gas mattered. He simply reminded her that respect for nature always came before curiosity. The woods felt unusually quiet that morning. No birds called from the branches above. Even the gentle breeze seemed to hesitate, as if the mountains themselves were listening. Ethan slowed his pace almost without realizing it. Years of hiking had taught him that silence often carried more meaning than sound. Lily noticed it too. "Dad," she whispered, "why is everything so still?" Ethan paused beside an old fallen cedar, scanning the surrounding trees with patient eyes. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But something has everyone paying attention." They walked another 100 yards before Ethan noticed tiny paw prints crossing the damp earth. Fresh tracks. Small enough to belong to a very young wolf. He crouched beside them, studying every detail without touching the ground. Lily knelt beside him, careful not to disturb the trail. "A pup?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Looks that way." He stood quietly and looked toward the dense timber ahead. "Stay close." The trail narrowed between moss-covered boulders before opening into a small clearing where morning sunlight slipped gently through the tall pines. That was when Lily stopped walking. "Dad," she whispered again, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. Curled beneath the roots of an overturned tree lay a tiny gray wolf cub. It was alive, breathing steadily, but clearly exhausted after what must have been a long night alone. The cub lifted its head just enough to notice the strangers before lowering it again without fear or aggression. Ethan remained perfectly still. Every instinct reminded him that a wolf pup was rarely alone for long. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the rest of the pack could be watching. He slowly removed his backpack without making a sudden movement. Lily held her breath, waiting for her father's decision. Ethan's eyes searched every shadow between the pines. The silence remained unbroken, yet it no longer felt empty. It felt patient. "We don't belong here," Lily whispered carefully. Ethan nodded once, never taking his eyes from the forest. "No," he answered. "But kindness belongs everywhere." As he took one careful step toward the injured cub, something extraordinary happened. High on the rocky ridge overlooking the clearing, nearly hidden among the morning mist, several gray wolves stood perfectly still. None growled. None moved. They simply watched the single father and his daughter with calm golden eyes, as though the entire wilderness had paused to see what choice one ordinary man would make next. Ethan did not rush forward. He lowered himself slowly until he was kneeling several feet away from the tiny wolf cub, making sure every movement was calm and predictable. Lily stayed exactly where he had asked her to stand, her wide blue eyes moving carefully between the small animal and the silent ridge above them. The wolves remained motionless. Their ears were raised. Their golden eyes never left the father and daughter. The forest felt as though it had stopped breathing. Ethan quietly opened his backpack and removed a clean wool blanket along with a stainless steel water bottle. He poured a little water into the bottle cap before gently sliding it across the ground. The cub lifted its head only slightly. It sniffed the water, then slowly drank without taking its eyes off Ethan. Lily smiled, but only for a moment. She understood that trust was fragile. One careless movement could erase it completely. "It is thirsty," she whispered. Ethan nodded. And tired. He carefully studied the little animal without touching it. One front paw appeared swollen, and the cub favored one side whenever it tried to move. There was no sign of blood, only the awkward stiffness of an injury that had probably come from a fall among the rocks. Ethan looked back toward the ridge. The adult wolves still had not moved. They neither threatened nor approached. Their patience felt almost impossible to understand. "Why are they letting us stay?" Lily asked softly. Ethan answered without taking his eyes off the trees. "Because they are deciding whether we deserve to." Those words settled quietly between them. Ethan had spent years teaching Lily that respect always began by recognizing boundaries. Wild animals did not exist to entertain people. They deserved distance, dignity, and peace. Today those same rules seemed to be guiding every decision he made. He slowly folded the blanket into a soft cushion and gently nudged it closer to the cub. The little wolf hesitated before lowering itself onto the warmer surface. It released a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. Lily could not hide the gentle smile growing across her face. "I think it knows you are trying to help," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe it simply knows we are not trying to hurt it." A cool breeze drifted through the pines, carrying the fresh scent of cedar and mountain sage. High above them, sunlight filtered through the branches, painting shifting patterns. Across the forest floor, everything felt peaceful, yet Ethan remained alert. He knew the pack could change its mind at any moment. He also knew that fear often disappeared when people chose patience over panic. He reached slowly into another pocket and removed a small emergency bandage from his hiking kit. Without forcing the cub or lifting it from the ground, he gently wrapped the injured paw just tightly enough to offer support. The little animal watched every movement, remaining surprisingly calm. When he finished, it carefully tested its weight. The limp was still there, but the cub stood a little steadier than before. Lily quietly clapped her hands once before catching herself and laughing under her breath. Ethan chuckled with her. "Small victories count too," he said. They waited another minute before Ethan stood and stepped backward, giving the cub all the space it needed. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the little wolf took 3 careful steps toward the edge of the clearing before stopping to look back at the father and daughter. At that exact moment, a deep but gentle howl echoed somewhere beyond the ridge. The cub lifted its ears immediately. One by one, the adult wolves appeared from the trees, never rushing, never showing aggression, simply walking with quiet confidence. They surrounded the cub at a respectful distance before the largest gray wolf paused and looked directly at Ethan. The animal held his gaze for only a heartbeat, then slowly turned away and led the family back into the forest. Ethan slipped his backpack over his shoulder. Lily watched the disappearing figures until the last gray tail vanished between the pines. She smiled and reached for her father's hand. "Do you think we will ever see them again?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the silent forest where the shadows had already swallowed every trace of the pack. He smiled gently and shook his head. "I do not know," he answered. "But somehow I think the forest will remember us long after today is over." The drive back to the cabin felt almost unreal. Neither Ethan nor Lily spoke for several miles because the silence inside the truck felt as meaningful as the silence they had left behind in the forest. Sunlight drifted through the windshield while golden leaves danced across the gravel road. Every familiar turn seemed unchanged, yet both of them sensed that something invisible had shifted. Lily finally looked away from the passing trees and smiled. "Do you think the little wolf will be all right?" Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel as he answered. "I think it has the best family it could ask for." Lily nodded, satisfied with that answer. When they reached the cabin, the afternoon settled into its usual rhythm. Ethan stacked the firewood they had collected while Lily filled bird feeders hanging from the porch. The mountain air smelled of pine needles, fresh earth, and wood smoke drifting from a distant chimney farther down the valley. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, but Ethan could not ignore the quiet feeling that someone was watching from beyond the tree line. He never felt threatened. It was simply a strange awareness that refused to disappear. As evening arrived, they shared homemade vegetable soup beside the fireplace while rain tapped gently against the cabin windows. Lily spread her wildlife notebook across the kitchen table and carefully drew the tiny wolf exactly as she remembered it. She paid special attention to the bright eyes and the folded ears before writing a single sentence beneath the sketch. Kindness always leaves a trail. Ethan noticed the words as he washed the dishes. He smiled without saying anything because they reminded him of lessons his own father had once taught him. The following morning brought clear skies and cool temperatures. Ethan planned to repair part of the fence surrounding the vegetable garden before winter arrived. Lily carried a small basket as she gathered fallen apples from the old tree beside the porch. Halfway through the morning, she suddenly stopped working. "Dad," she called quietly. Ethan walked over and followed her gaze toward the edge of the forest. Standing between the pines was a single gray wolf. It remained perfectly still, watching the cabin from a respectful distance. It was impossible to know whether it was the same pack they had encountered yet. Something about its calm posture felt familiar. Neither Ethan nor Lily moved closer. They simply stood together in silence. After nearly a minute, the wolf turned gracefully and disappeared into the trees without making a sound. Ethan returned to repairing the fence, but Lily continued glancing toward the forest every few minutes. "Do you think it came to say thank you?" she asked. Ethan gently shook his head. "Wild animals do not think the way we do," he replied. "But they remember more than most people realize." During the next several days, little moments like that began happening again and again. Fresh wolf tracks appeared near the stream every morning, always several yards away from the cabin. Sometimes distant howls echoed across the valley shortly after sunset, never sounding threatening, only peaceful. Once, while Ethan and Lily hiked their favorite trail, they caught brief glimpses of gray shapes moving through the trees on the hillside above them. The wolves never approached. They simply traveled in the same direction before quietly fading back into the forest. Even the local wildlife seemed different. Deer grazed calmly near the meadow without sudden panic. Ravens circled overhead before settling in the tallest pines. The entire landscape carried an unusual balance that Ethan struggled to explain. One afternoon, they stopped at the small general store in town to buy flour, canned vegetables, and lamp oil. Old Mr. Henderson leaned against the front porch as always, greeting everyone who passed by. He smiled when he saw Ethan and Lily. "Folks have been talking," the elderly man said. Ethan looked puzzled. "Talking about what?" Mr. Henderson chuckled softly. "People keep saying they have seen wolves near your property almost every day. Funny thing is, nobody has lost livestock and nobody has reported any trouble. They just watch and leave." Ethan exchanged a quiet glance with Lily before thanking the old man and carrying their supplies back to the truck. Neither of them mentioned the injured cub. Some moments felt too sacred to explain. As they drove home beneath the towering mountains, Lily looked toward the endless forest stretching beside the road. Far beyond the pines, almost hidden among the shadows, several gray figures moved silently along a distant ridge. They kept the same steady pace as Ethan's truck for nearly half a mile before disappearing together into the deep green wilderness once again. 3 mornings later, the mountains welcomed another clear autumn sunrise, and the valley seemed wrapped in a quiet peace that only remote wilderness could offer. Ethan Brooks loaded a small day pack with water, sandwiches, a first aid kit, and Lily's favorite pair of binoculars before they set out toward an old fire lookout trail they had explored many times over the years. The familiar path wound through towering pine trees, crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a sparkling creek, and climbed gently toward a broad granite overlook where visitors could see miles of untouched forest. Lily walked a few steps ahead, stopping every so often to admire colorful leaves or identify bird calls she had learned from her field guide. Ethan smiled as he watched her curiosity grow stronger with every season. He believed the greatest gift a parent could give was not wealth or comfort, but confidence, patience, and respect for the natural world. As they climbed higher, The forest slowly became quieter than usual. It was not an empty silence. It was the same thoughtful stillness Ethan had noticed on the morning they found the injured cub. He raised one hand, signaling Lily to stop. She immediately understood and stood beside him without asking questions. Together they listened. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine resin across the ridge. Dry leaves rolled gently over the trail. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against an old tree before everything became still again. Ethan carefully studied the surrounding slopes. Nothing looked dangerous, yet every instinct encouraged him to pay closer attention. Lily whispered, "Do you feel it too?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, something is different." They continued another quarter of a mile before reaching a wide granite shelf overlooking the valley. The view stretched for countless acres, with dark green forests flowing across rolling mountains beneath an endless blue sky. Lily lifted her binoculars and admired a herd of elk grazing peacefully in a distant meadow. Suddenly she lowered the binoculars and gently touched her father's arm. "Dad," she whispered with amazement. Ethan followed her gaze toward the opposite ridge. One gray wolf stepped quietly from behind a cluster of evergreens. Then another appeared. A third emerged from the shadows. Within moments, nearly the entire pack stood along the rocky hillside, each animal calm, alert, and perfectly still. None showed fear. None displayed aggression. They simply watched Ethan and Lily with quiet confidence. The sight was breathtaking. Sunlight reflected softly across their thick gray coats, while the cool mountain breeze carried the faint scent of cedar between them. Ethan slowly removed his hat as a gesture of respect rather than necessity. Lily stood beside him with wide eyes filled with wonder. "They came," she whispered. Ethan answered softly. "They chose to be seen." For nearly a full minute no one moved. The wolves held their positions with remarkable discipline, almost as though an invisible conversation was taking place without a single sound. Then the largest wolf turned its head toward a narrow trail leading farther into the mountains. One after another the others began walking in that direction before pausing again to glance back toward Ethan. Lily looked up at her father. "Are they waiting for us?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He watched the animals with patient attention before saying, "I think they want us to notice something, but we will never chase them. If they truly want us to follow, they will make that clear." As if responding to his words, the lead wolf continued walking only a short distance before stopping again. The rest of the pack remained scattered along the trail, never disappearing completely into the trees. Ethan and Lily exchanged another quiet glance. They followed at a respectful distance, never hurrying and never attempting to close the gap. Every few hundred feet the wolves slowed just enough for the father and daughter to keep them in sight. The trail gradually climbed toward higher ground where ancient pines gave way to open granite slopes and sweeping mountain views. The journey felt less like being led by wild animals and more like receiving an invitation that had been offered with extraordinary trust. Ethan could not explain why the pack seemed so comfortable with their presence, but he understood one thing with complete certainty. Respect had opened a door that force never could. As the afternoon sun drifted lower across the mountains, the wolves reached another broad overlook and quietly waited together beneath the golden light, as though the wilderness itself had chosen to reveal one more secret to the only two people who had first chosen compassion over fear. The wolves remained ahead of Ethan and Lily without ever appearing to lead by command or invitation. They simply moved with quiet confidence, stopping often enough that the father and daughter could continue along the ancient mountain trail at a comfortable pace. The higher they climbed, the more the forest began to change. Tall pines slowly gave way to scattered evergreens growing between wide granite formations polished smooth by countless winters. Cool mountain air carried the clean scent of stone, cedar, and distant streams. It felt older somehow, as though this hidden corner of the wilderness had remained untouched for generations. Lily adjusted her backpack and smiled at her father. "I have never been this far before." Ethan looked across the endless ridges stretching toward the horizon. "Neither have I," he admitted. "Sometimes the best places are the ones that cannot be found on a map." The wolves continued forward until they reached a broad overlook surrounded by towering rock formations. Instead of disappearing into the trees, they quietly spread out across the ridge. Some rested beneath small evergreens while others stood facing the valley below. None paid attention to Ethan or Lily anymore. They behaved as though the father and daughter had simply become another peaceful part of the landscape. Ethan slowly removed his binoculars and scanned the valley beneath them. Something unusual immediately caught his attention. Large sections of forest on the opposite slope showed signs of severe drought. The trees remained standing, but many displayed fading needles and thinning crowns. Farther down the valley, a narrow creek that usually flowed year-round had become little more than a ribbon of shallow water reflecting the afternoon sun. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. "That is not normal," he said quietly. Lily looked through her own binoculars. "The water is almost gone." Ethan nodded. "The mountains have been much drier this year." They stood silently for several moments while a gentle breeze swept across the overlook. One of the older wolves slowly walked toward the edge of the ridge and looked down into the valley before turning its head toward Ethan. The movement seemed deliberate but never demanding. Ethan followed the direction of the wolf's attention and noticed several game trails weaving toward a shaded canyon hidden beneath dense evergreens. Fresh animal tracks covered nearly every visible path. Deer, elk, mountain goats. Even black bears had recently traveled through the same narrow corridor. Lily lowered her binoculars with growing excitement. "Everything is moving the same way." Ethan smiled as the pieces slowly began fitting together. "They're searching for dependable water." Lily looked back at the wolves. "So the pack already knew." Ethan nodded. Animals notice changes long before people do. The realization settled quietly over both of them. The wolves had not brought them there to perform some impossible miracle. They had simply revealed something the wilderness had already been saying to anyone willing to listen. Ethan reached into his backpack and removed a small notebook where he often recorded trail conditions and wildlife observations. He carefully sketched the valley, marking the drying creek, the healthy canyon below, and the countless crossing trails. Lily watched with admiration. "Are you going to tell the forest rangers?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan answered. "They should know what is happening before winter arrives." A soft howl drifted gently across the mountains. Another answered from farther away, followed by a third echoing from deep within the valley. The sounds blended together like an ancient conversation carried by the wind. None felt frightening. Instead, they filled the mountains with a quiet sense of belonging that Ethan had never experienced before. He closed his notebook and looked toward the wolves once more. The young gray cub stepped forward from behind one of the older animals. Its injured paw now carried weight naturally, and it walked with confident, playful steps beside the rest of the pack. Lily's face brightened instantly. "Dad," she whispered, "it healed." Ethan smiled warmly without speaking. The little wolf paused for a brief moment and looked directly toward them before following the others across the ridge. There was no fear in its eyes now, only quiet confidence. As golden evening light spread across the granite cliffs, the pack disappeared one by one into the evergreen forest beyond the overlook. Ethan and Lily remained standing together until the final gray silhouette vanished among the trees. Neither of them felt disappointed. Instead, they understood that trust did not mean possession. Some friendships existed only because both sides respected the freedom of the other. With that thought resting peacefully in his heart, Ethan turned toward the trail home, unaware that the quiet discovery written inside his small notebook would soon become important to far more people than he could possibly imagine. The following week brought even drier weather, and Ethan Brooks could not stop thinking about the valley hidden beyond the granite overlook. Early Monday morning, he drove to the small ranger station a few miles outside town with Lily sitting beside him and the notebook resting carefully on the dashboard. Ranger Daniel Harper welcomed them with a warm smile before inviting them inside. Ethan unfolded his hand-drawn map across the wooden table and quietly explained everything they had seen. He described the drying creek, the unusual concentration of wildlife moving toward the shaded canyon, and the calm behavior of the wolf pack. Daniel listened without interrupting, occasionally comparing Ethan's notes with official topographic maps hanging on the wall. When Ethan finished, the ranger remained silent for several thoughtful seconds before nodding with quiet respect. Your observations match some satellite reports we received last week, Daniel said. We knew something was changing, but we did not know exactly where the wildlife had started relocating. Lily looked at the maps with growing curiosity. Does that mean the animals found a safer place before people noticed? Daniel smiled gently. That is exactly what it means. Ethan never mentioned rescuing the wolf cub. Some moments belonged only to the forest, and he believed they should remain that way. Over the next several days, the ranger service quietly surveyed the hidden canyon Ethan had marked. They discovered a spring-fed stream flowing beneath thick evergreen cover where cool water continued running despite the unusually dry season. Rangers began placing temporary signs along nearby hiking trails, encouraging visitors to avoid disturbing the area while wildlife naturally gathered around the dependable water source. Local conservation volunteers also helped monitor animal movement without interfering. Ethan felt grateful that the response focused on protection rather than attention. One cool afternoon, he and Lily returned to their favorite trail carrying only cameras and lunch. The mountains seemed peaceful again. Autumn sunlight shimmered through golden aspens while crisp air carried the comforting scent of pine needles and clean water. As they reached the familiar granite overlook, Lily suddenly stopped walking and smiled without saying a word. Across the open ridge stood the same wolf pack. The young cub was larger now, its gray coat thicker and healthier than before. It walked confidently beside the older wolves with no trace of its earlier injury. Ethan and Lily remained exactly where they were, giving the animals every inch of space they deserved. No barriers separated them except quiet understanding. The lead wolf stepped forward only a few feet before sitting calmly beneath a windswept pine tree. The rest of the pack settled nearby. They were neither performing nor posing. They simply existed together beneath the wide Montana sky, sharing the same peaceful afternoon with two people who had chosen kindness over fear. Lily sat on a flat rock beside her father. They quietly ate their sandwiches while watching hawks circle above the valley. After several minutes, Lily whispered, "It feels like they trust us." Ethan smiled gently without looking away from the mountains. "Trust is never given because someone demands it," he replied. "It grows when respect is repeated over time." A light breeze crossed the overlook, carrying the scent of cedar, stone, and fresh mountain water. One by one, the wolves rose and continued their journey toward the distant forest, disappearing with the same quiet dignity that had marked every encounter since the day Ethan had first seen the injured cub beneath the fallen tree. There were no dramatic farewells and no impossible miracles. Only the steady rhythm of nature continuing exactly as it should. As father and daughter began the hike back toward their cabin, they noticed more signs of quiet renewal throughout the valley. Deer grazed comfortably in open meadows. Songbirds filled the air with cheerful calls that had been absent only weeks earlier. Fresh water sparkled once again through shaded creeks fed by hidden springs. Ethan understood that the greatest reward had never been that the wolves remembered him. The true gift was realizing that one simple act of compassion had encouraged him to pay closer attention to the living world around him, and, because he had listened with patience instead of pride, both people and wildlife now shared a safer future. Lily slipped her small notebook into her backpack before taking her father's hand as they followed the winding trail home. Behind them, somewhere beyond the tall pines, a single peaceful howl drifted across the mountains, and this time it did not sound like a mystery. It sounded like the quiet promise that kindness, once freely given, always finds its way back through the wilderness in ways no one can ever predict. Autumn slowly gave way to the first hints of winter, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm for Ethan, Brooks, and Lily. Frost painted the meadow each morning. Thin layers of ice shimmered across quiet puddles, and the smoke rising from their stone chimney curled gently into crisp blue skies. Their cabin remained simple, warm, and filled with the small routines that had always carried them through every season. Ethan repaired tools, stacked another row of firewood, and prepared the vegetable garden for the colder months ahead, while Lily spent hours reading books about wildlife conservation beside the fireplace. Although the remarkable encounters in the mountains had become treasured memories, neither of them expected the story to continue. Then, one Saturday afternoon, an unfamiliar pickup truck stopped outside their cabin. Ranger Daniel Harper stepped out together with a woman wearing the uniform of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She introduced herself as Rebecca Collins, a regional wildlife biologist who had been studying wolf migration throughout the area for several years. Her warm smile immediately put Lily at ease. "I have heard wonderful things about your wildlife observations," Rebecca said as she shook Ethan's hand. Ethan smiled politely. "I only wrote down what I happened to notice." Rebecca glanced toward the surrounding forest before replying, "Sometimes careful observation is the most valuable thing anyone can offer." Inside the cabin, they spread maps, trail notes, and seasonal wildlife reports across the dining table. Rebecca explained that the changing weather patterns had quietly altered animal movement throughout several mountain valleys. Many experienced researchers had noticed unusual migration routes, but Ethan's detailed notebook had helped identify one of the safest natural wildlife corridors before larger problems developed. Lily listened proudly while sipping warm apple cider. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "I am not a scientist," he said honestly. Rebecca smiled with quiet respect. "You did something many people forget to do. You listened before you spoke. Nature rewards people who pay attention." Those words stayed with Ethan long after the visitors returned to town. During the following weeks, conservation volunteers began quietly improving hiking signs around sensitive wildlife areas. Temporary observation zones encouraged visitors to enjoy the forest without disturbing the animals. Local schools even invited Rebecca to teach children about respecting wild spaces instead of fearing them. Lily attended every presentation she could, eagerly filling another notebook with sketches and facts about wolves, elk, birds, and mountain ecosystems. Ethan noticed how her dream of becoming a wildlife biologist seemed stronger than ever. One bright December morning, they returned to the overlook where the wolves had first appeared together beneath the golden autumn sky. Snow now covered the granite ledges in soft white layers, and every pine branch sparkled beneath fresh frost. The mountains looked peaceful beyond words. They stood quietly for several minutes without expecting to see anything unusual. Then Lily smiled. Fresh wolf tracks crossed the snow only a short distance away. They were perfectly clear, leading from one side of the ridge toward the distant valley. Ethan knelt beside the tracks without touching them. The prints varied in size. Some belonged to adults. Others belonged to younger wolves whose paws had grown noticeably since autumn. Lily laughed softly. "The little one is getting bigger." Ethan nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Just like someone else I know." Lily grinned at her father before slipping her hand into his glove. Neither of them attempted to follow the tracks. They understood that the greatest expression of respect was allowing the pack to remain truly wild. Instead, they stood together overlooking the snowy valley where sunlight reflected across frozen streams and endless forests stretching toward the horizon. Suddenly, a familiar howl floated gently through the cold mountain air. Another answered from farther away, followed by several more until the peaceful voices echoed across the ridges like a quiet winter choir. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply as the sound drifted through the crisp air. He did not hear ownership. He did not hear gratitude spoken in words. He heard something even more meaningful. He heard harmony. When the final echo faded into the distant mountains, father and daughter turned toward home with calm smiles and grateful hearts, knowing that some friendships were never meant to be held tightly. They were simply meant to remind people that dignity, patience, and kindness could build bridges between worlds that usually passed each other in silence. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the mountains, and by early spring the valleys surrounding Ethan Brooks's cabin were beginning to awaken once again. Snow retreated from the lower trails, fresh green shoots pushed through the damp earth, and the familiar songs of returning birds filled the crisp morning air. Ethan and Lily welcomed the changing season the way they always had, with quiet gratitude and simple routines. They repaired sections of the hiking trail near their property, planted vegetables in the small garden beside the cabin, and spent long evenings on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant peaks with shades of gold and crimson. Life remained peaceful, but something else had quietly changed. More people had begun visiting the nearby ranger station after hearing about the successful efforts to protect the mountain wildlife corridor. Families came to hike responsibly, students joined nature walks, and volunteers offered their time to restore damaged trails and clean stream banks. Ranger Daniel Harper often invited Ethan to join these community outings, not because he wanted recognition, but because his calm respect for the wilderness inspired others without a single speech. Ethan always accepted with humility. During one Saturday volunteer project, children gathered around while Lily explained how to recognize animal tracks without disturbing them. She smiled as she showed them the difference between deer prints, elk tracks, fox trails, and wolf footprints preserved in soft mud after a light rain. One little boy asked with wide eyes, "Have you ever seen a wolf?" Lily looked toward her father before answering with a gentle smile. "Yes," she said softly. "The most important thing I learned was not how close I could get. It was learning when to stop and let them be wild." The adults nearby exchanged quiet smiles. Rebecca Collins, who had joined the conservation event that morning, later walked beside Ethan along the restored trail. "Your daughter has become an excellent teacher," she said. Ethan looked ahead where Lily laughed with the younger children while pointing toward a soaring hawk. "She learned from the best classroom I could ever give her," he replied. Rebecca nodded toward the forest stretching across the valley. "And from a father who understood that kindness is stronger than fear." Ethan lowered his eyes modestly. "I only tried to do the right thing." Rebecca smiled. "That is usually how the most important stories begin." As afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall pines, the group reached a newly installed observation platform overlooking the protected valley. Visitors quietly admired deer grazing in open meadows, while a family of wild turkeys crossed the edge of the forest. Informational signs encouraged patience, respect, and responsible wildlife viewing instead of chasing photographs or close encounters. Ethan appreciated every word because the message reflected exactly what he hoped Lily would carry throughout her life. Before leaving, Ranger Daniel gathered the volunteers for a simple thank you. Instead of presenting awards or certificates, he handed each person a young pine sapling to plant somewhere meaningful. "Healthy forests begin one tree at a time," he said with a warm smile. Ethan and Lily carried their small sapling back toward the cabin. They chose a sunny clearing overlooking the same valley where so many quiet lessons had unfolded during the past year. Together they dug a careful hole, placed the young tree into the rich mountain soil, and gently covered the roots. Lily poured fresh spring water around the base before stepping back beside her father. The tiny evergreen looked almost fragile against the vast landscape, yet Ethan knew that strength often began in quiet places. As the evening breeze moved gently through the surrounding pines, a distant chorus of familiar howls floated across the valley. The sounds were soft, peaceful, and wonderfully unhurried. Neither Ethan nor Lily searched for the wolves. They simply listened with grateful hearts, understanding that true respect never demanded proof. The mountains already held every answer they needed. Ethan rested one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder as they watched the young pine sway beneath the fading golden light. He realized that the greatest legacy he could ever leave his daughter was not a cabin, a truck, or even the land they loved. It was the quiet habit of choosing compassion when fear would have been easier, of listening before judging, and of protecting what could never speak for itself. Somewhere beyond the endless trees, the wilderness continued its timeless rhythm, and for one peaceful moment, father, daughter, forest, and wolves all seemed to share the very same heartbeat. Several years passed, and the quiet story that had begun beneath a fallen tree remained known only to a handful of people who understood that some of the greatest moments in life were never meant to become headlines. Ethan Brooks continued living in the same modest cabin, surrounded by the mountains he loved, never seeking recognition for anything that had happened. The hiking trails were healthier than they had been in years, the protected wildlife corridor flourished with careful stewardship, and the forests echoed each season with the steady rhythm of life returning exactly as nature intended. Lily grew into the future she had once imagined while sitting beside a mountain creek with a notebook in her lap. She studied wildlife biology at a university in Montana and eventually returned home, determined to protect the same wilderness that had shaped her childhood. Whenever young students joined her educational hikes, she taught them something that could not be found in textbooks. She reminded them that every living creature deserved respect before curiosity, and that understanding always began with quiet observation. Ethan often walked beside those groups without introducing himself as anything special. He simply carried extra water, pointed out hidden wildflowers, and helped children notice details they might otherwise overlook. One bright autumn afternoon, almost exactly 10 years after the day everything had changed, father and daughter returned to the broad granite overlooking the valley. The young pine tree they had planted together years earlier now stood tall and healthy, its branches swaying gently in the cool mountain breeze. Around it, countless other trees had taken root through community conservation efforts, slowly transforming the hillside into a symbol of patient hope. Lily rested one hand against the rough bark and smiled. "It grew stronger than I imagined," she said quietly. Ethan looked across the endless forest stretching toward the distant peaks. "The best things usually do," he answered. They remained there in comfortable silence while golden afternoon light drifted across the mountains. The air carried the familiar sense of cedar, pine, and fresh earth after a gentle morning rain. A hawk circled high above the valley. A small herd of elk crossed a distant meadow with calm confidence. Everything seemed peaceful, balanced, and wonderfully alive. Then Lily noticed movement near the opposite ridge. She raised her binoculars slowly before lowering them again with a smile that needed no explanation. Ethan followed her gaze. Standing among the evergreens, illuminated by warm autumn sunlight, was a gray wolf. Beside it stood several younger wolves, now fully grown, their thick coats shining against the mountain landscape. One of them paused and turned toward Ethan and Lily. For a long moment the distance between people and wildlife seemed to disappear beneath nothing more than mutual respect. No one moved closer. No one called out. No one attempted to capture the moment beyond quietly living it. The wolves remained only a short while before the lead animal calmly turned toward the forest. One by one the others followed, disappearing into the trees with the same quiet dignity that had always defined every encounter. As the final gray silhouette faded into the wilderness, a peaceful howl drifted gently across the valley. Another answered from farther away until the mountains carried the sound from ridge to ridge before allowing it to dissolve into silence once more. Ethan smiled softly. "They never belonged to us," he said. Lily nodded. "No," she replied. "But they trusted us enough to remind us who we should be." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. He realized that the greatest miracle had never been that an entire wolf pack remembered one simple act of kindness. The true miracle was that kindness had shaped a little girl into a compassionate woman, had encouraged a community to protect its wilderness, and had quietly changed countless lives without demanding applause. As father and daughter began the familiar walk back toward the cabin, the evening sun settled behind the mountains, filling the valley with warm golden light. Their footsteps blended gently with the sounds of flowing water, whispering pines, and distant birds returning to their nests. Nothing about the ending felt dramatic, and that was exactly what made it beautiful. Some stories do not end with crowds cheering or heroes standing beneath bright lights. Some stories end with a father and his daughter walking home together, carrying nothing except gratitude, quiet dignity, and the unshakable belief that every act of compassion leaves a trail, even if only the wilderness remembers where it began.